distinguished delegates, excellencies. It's a pleasure to address the Third Committee of the General Assembly for the second and last time. Today I present you a report that aims at discussing how the recognition of persons affected by leprosy and their family members as persons who are entitled to the rights provided for in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is an important step in protecting this group of people, eliminating systemic discrimination against them, and fulfilling their human rights. Persons affected by leprosy should be fully recognized as persons with disabilities in accordance with Articles 1 and 2 of the CRPD, not only on the grounds of physical impairments caused by leprosy and the multiple barriers to their full participation imposed by society, but also on the ground of discrimination based on harmful stereotypes about leprosy itself. Furthermore, many family members experience psychosocial impairments and disabilities owing to systemic discrimination on the grounds of leprosy. Yet, persons affected by leprosy and their family members have been largely excluded from the global conversation about disability, and society's disabling forces affecting them have been left unexamined. Constitutional norms, legislation, programs, and strategies in force in some countries where leprosy is relevant create favorable conditions for protecting the rights of persons with leprosy-related impairments and disabilities. This situation notwithstanding, there are important challenges regarding the execution and implementation of such frameworks, as well as significant problems with the content of the aforementioned norms, legislation, programs, and strategies. Issues around the assessment and recognition of invisible impairments and psychosocial impairments, disability as the interaction between impairments and society's restrictions, effective access to disability-related benefits, the right to an effective remedy and reparation, the elimination of discriminatory legal and regulatory frameworks, the elimination of harmful stereotypes, the intersection of leprosy with poverty and with geographical barriers for people living in remote areas, and measures to protect the rights of people living in former leprosy colonies remain unaddressed. In essence, disability rights seem to be restricted to social protection, and decisions on who is or is not entitled to such protection remain largely in the hands of the medical professions. And the medical workers only measure physical visible impairments, dismissing social barriers to inclusion. Another issue of concern is the limited participation of persons affected by leprosy and their representative organizations in institutional matters relating to them, as well as in umbrella organizations for persons with disabilities. There are numerous systemic barriers to the full and meaningful participation of persons affected by leprosy and their family members, and states should, according to General Comment number 7 of the CRPD, create and put in place measures that can address these same barriers. Not only are persons with disabilities a diverse group of people, but their problems and needs may also differ from those of other persons with disabilities, which emphasizes the importance of recognizing diversity and consulting all groups of persons with disabilities, including persons affected by leprosy. While progress made in the elaboration of norms at the national level that recognize equality for persons with disabilities is well known, states should do more to effectively implement the provisions of the CRPD, given the fact that in practice the implementation of such norms, and I'm speaking in general terms, reproduces paternalistic approaches that largely fail to promote systemic change. Importantly, it is clarified in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that states' obligations include not only non-discrimination, but also taking all the steps necessary to eliminate barriers and promote enabling environments that guarantee the right of persons with disabilities to enjoy opportunities on an equal basis with others. Undoubtedly, systemic change requires more than what is provided for in the majority of existing national legal and regulatory frameworks. Excellencies, during the past years, I have thoroughly documented discrimination on the grounds of leprosy. With a people-centered approach to the implementation of the mandate entrusted to me by the Human Rights Council, I sought to bridge a group of people who experience multiple and systemic discrimination and who have been largely unacknowledged by the United Nations system as a whole with the relevant human rights mechanisms and agencies. One critical step states could take to protect, promote, and fulfill the rights of persons affected by leprosy is to recognize them as being entitled to disability rights and ensure their voices are heard and taken into account in policy making. I thank you for your attention. I would like to start by recalling that in 2010, the General Assembly passed a resolution that it's accompanied by the set of principles and guidelines for the elimination of discrimination against persons affected by leprosy and their family members, and that my mandate was precisely created to support the implementation of such instrument. I have presented a report in 2020 to the Human Rights Council, which is a policy framework aimed precisely at supporting member states to implement such an instrument. So I would like to leave an appeal, since this is my last time here, for states to develop national plans for the implementation of this human rights instrument. I was asked what were my priorities during these last 5 years. Of course, one of my priorities was to support states to eliminate any discrimination in law. Unfortunately, there are still more than 100 laws that actively discriminate against persons affected by leprosy and their families worldwide. Other priority was indeed to support the guarantee of access to social, economic, and cultural rights. But I would say that my first priority was to support the empowerment of persons affected by leprosy, as it was also mentioned here. And I believe that this was the more important thing that I have done during these 5 years, because there is no systemic change without self-determination. So I would also like to leave an appeal to member states to support the autonomy and self-determination of persons affected by leprosy and engage with their representative organizations. I was also asked many questions that relate to the ongoing situation of extreme vulnerability and poverty experienced by persons affected by leprosy. Indeed, international cooperation is of the essence to tackle this situation, and we do know that the SDGs provide for the need of international cooperation towards making them materialized in people's lives and not just on discourse. We have been more successful in the field of international cooperation on what regards cooperation between private actors, civil society organizations, than between member states. States can cooperate among themselves, but also with civil society organizations working on the ground. They can also provide technical and economic assistance to those countries that struggle with leprosy. They can support in capacity building, but they can also support more research for better drugs, better treatment, more dignified treatment. And I would like to recall that we still do not have child-friendly options for children affected by leprosy on what regards medical treatment. It would also be quite important if member states could cooperate on what regards access, the right of access to information for persons affected by leprosy. That would touch the same issue of empowerment. And without empowerment, there is no democracy because people are not able to engage in public affairs. The CRPD provides several guidance on regard to international cooperation, so I will not take too long with regard to this issue. But I think that I was also asked a question about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and this very much relates to the issue of development. I have presented a report to the Human Rights Council about the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on people's lives, on persons affected by leprosy's lives, and I have provided a set of recommendations to building back better. But I see with regret that we as society are still not on the right path to truly building back better. So many of the structural issues that made that COVID-19 came as a very real threat to life, not just because of the disease, but mostly because of its impact in terms of social and economic rights, the same structural issues affecting persons affected by leprosy are still there. So I see the area of economic and social rights as really the key area for building back better, but not much done yet on that regard. With regard to the need for a new paradigm coming from top to bottom, meaning from the WHO on regard to disability rights for persons affected by leprosy, it is true indeed that WHO technical guidelines only measure physical, visible impairments related to leprosy. But persons affected by leprosy, as I explain on my report, experience also invisible impairments and psychosocial impairments, but we do have some instruments. For instance, the questions created by the Washington Group on Disability. And we do need we need more efforts done on ensuring key principles of the CRPD, such as accessibility, reasonable accommodation, etc., for truly promoting systemic change. I was asked many questions about participation, and I was asked how could I support governments to connect to people living in remote communities. It is not I who should do that. It's the organizations of persons affected by leprosy. There are quite a few, both grassroots and with a national scale. We have a great deal of examples of how their participation is transforming their peers' lives. In Colombia, people support the healthcare system to go in when they go into the communities and they diagnose leprosy. And this is quite key because they are preventing the development of physical impairments. In Brazil, the National Association is quite active and was the one responsible for changing the laws, for abolishing one discriminatory law back in the 1990s. But in Brazil, the Organization of Persons Affected by Leprosy was also responsible for changing the name of leprosy to Hansen's disease. And with this, I come to another question. I am a strong supporter of changing the name of leprosy to Hansen's disease. I have seen in Brazil how that can really mitigate stigmatization. Just think, If you were diagnosed with leprosy, what would you prefer to say to your families and friends? I have leprosy or I have Hansen's disease. Leprosy is much more than a disease. It is indeed a label, highly stigmatized by millenniums of history. So, like it happened with other diseases, I strongly support the change of the name, which should take place at the WHO. I would like to conclude by mentioning something that I've learned a long time ago. When we look at society from the margins, we usually see what's wrong. And that is precisely what persons affected by leprosy can tell you. So it is quite important to support their empowerment and participation in order for us all to being able to build better and more just societies. I thank you.